In this video, we're going to talk about the synapse. We're going to look at what the synapse is, how neurotransmitters transmit messages across the synapse, and how drugs affect these neurotransmitters in the synapse. So firstly, what is the synapse? In the previous video, we talked about neurons being the cells that make up nerves and send messages electrochemically around the body. The axon of one neuron connects to the dendrite of another neuron. And at this connection, they don't actually touch, but what happens is there's a little tiny gap between the axon and the dendrite, and this little tiny gap is called the synapse. Because the axon and the dendrite are not touching each other, we have this little gap. That electrochemical potential isn't able to cross across that gap. So what happens is this electrochemical impulse or action potential needs to be turned into a chemical message to cross this gap. The chemicals that send that message are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are released from the axon of one neuron or the presynaptic terminal and pass that message across the synapse. Some examples of neurotransmitters include acetylcholine, noradrenaline, serotonin, and gamma-aminobutyric acid. Once these neurotransmitters have been released into the synapse, there are receptors that are found on the postsynaptic terminal. So that the postsynaptic terminal is the dendrite of the next neuron. And if enough of these neurotransmitters bond with enough of the receptors, they then elicit a response, which could be either inhibitory to stop something from happening or action to make something happen in the dendrite of the next neuron. And this message can then be continued down the nerve. Once the neurotransmitters have bonded with the receptors and elicited the response, they then release. And there are two ways that these neurotransmitters are then destroyed. One way is that they are recycled back into the presynaptic terminal to be used again. And another way is that enzymes come along and destroy these neurotransmitters. If the neurotransmitters hang around for too long, they will stimulate too much of a response, and this can be bad. Now, most drugs affect these neurotransmitters and how they work within the synapse. And there's a few different types of drugs that work in different ways to elicit a response. The first type of drug we're going to talk about is an agonist. And these simulate neurotransmitters. So once they get into the body and the blood and in the synapse, they bind to the receptors and then initiate the response, whatever response that neurotransmitter was going to do. For example, tetrahydrocannabinol is an example of an agonist that binds to those receptors to elicit a response. Antagonists do the opposite. They bind to the receptors to stop a response happening. So because they're bound to the receptor, the neurotransmitters can't get into the receptor, and therefore it can't stimulate that response and send the message. An example of this is paracetamol to stop the transmission of pain. Another type of drug is called reuptake inhibitors. And what these do is they block that reuptake or the recycling of the neurotransmitter, meaning that more of the neurotransmitter hangs around in that synapse and produces more of a response. An example of a drug that is a reuptake inhibitor are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are used in the treatment of depression. In this video, we've looked at the synapse being the gap between the axon and dendrite of two neurons. We've looked at neurotransmitters being the chemical messengers that pass the message across the synapse from the presynaptic terminal or axon to the postsynaptic terminal or dendrite. And we've looked at how drugs affect the neurotransmitters in that synapse, being either agonists that elicit a response, antagonists that block the receptors so they can't be used, or reuptake inhibitors which stop the recycling of the neurotransmitter, increasing the amount of response that occurs.